Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning. Welcome to the last lecture of this week and the last lecture of this course on understanding and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Focus on scope 1 and 2 emission reduction through building design and construction. I am only going to give you a course summary, what all we have studied through the course of last 8 weeks. So, starting with the week 1, we were trying to understand the whole concept of sustainability and sustainable development. How did we start to discuss about sustainability and sustainable development, where all it started, how we defined and why we defined sustainable development goals and millennium development goals for us. Why was it driving? Why was the whole discussion around sustainability and sustainable development happening? We found out that it was primarily happening because of the climate change. So, climate change was at the center of it. Of course, there were people and there was economy that was also revolving around with this discussion. But primarily the concern is, which not just was but is the climate change. The risk that we face, the entire planet faces because of this climate change happening, and what are the impacts of this development and climate change on land, water and air. So, we were trying to form a basis of why we are doing this in week 1. In week 2, we saw how historically different organizations started to emerge and talk about this whole discussion on climate change, and from climate change we came how the consensus was formed around how greenhouse gases are driving this climate change. They are the main culprits. Why are the greenhouse gases being emitted? What are the activities which are responsible for that? And then the world came together for different protocols, for example, Kyoto Protocol, and then Paris Agreement happened. So, we saw historically how this whole idea developed, and what are greenhouse gases? How do we come to one single number? How can we simplify to get one single number, and that we called as carbon footprint, and how can we calculate? We saw that it is an exhaustive exercise, lot of activities are there, lot of small, big, multiple processes are going to take place whenever we are talking about any one single activity, and so it is never going to be absolute. It is never going to be absolutely accurate, but then we can have an idea, a comparative idea from past to now between two different entities, and this is what the whole idea is about the discussion on carbon emissions. Then we saw that how we put all of this together in the form of a protocol which was uniform, because if I had to calculate carbon emissions, I could have some different standards and baseline that I could take, maybe coming from one country, and this other person coming from another country could have different benchmark and baseline. How do we compare? Because the world has to come together and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So, there was a need felt for having a protocol in place which would remain common for everybody, and that is where we saw how GHG protocol and ISO international standards came into existence. And from there, once we studied GHG protocol and ISO standards, we saw what are, for the first time, what are the scope 1, 2 and 3 of GHG emissions. What do we consider as scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3, and how do we identify, how do we determine? So, we know a whole array of activities, processes that are included, but how do we determine this is scope 1, 2 and 3. So, we discussed that in the week 3. And in week 4, we specifically talked about the understanding of India specific GHG programs. So, India has committed big when it participated in Paris Agreement, and so there are specific India specific GHG programs where we are trying to reduce our emissions, and this is the aim that we want to become net zero. Leading to further going ahead with accounting methods and data collection, because the standardization of this whole process is important, and that is what GHG program and the GHG platform has done, along with the calculation tools that are being developed. So, it is still an ongoing developing field. We are not even discussing about through this entire lecture the trading that is happening. We are right now focusing only on calculating how much emission is happening and how we can reduce the emission. And in this week, we talked for the first time understanding the role of buildings and related emission. So, if you follow the entire discussion about greenhouse gases, you will see that there is very little discussion on how buildings are impacting the carbon dioxide emissions, the carbon footprint of any business, while buildings have a significant role to play. So, most of the time what we think is that it is the real estate, or it is scope 3, because it is an asset lot of times leased, but it directly impacts the scope 2 is what we were establishing, starting to discuss in week 4. In week 5, we looked at the examples, 5 examples of different types of businesses, companies. We looked at example of airports, university campuses, then we looked at fuel supply companies, IT campus and real estate companies, 5 of them, trying to understand their emissions, scope 1, 2 and 3, and where are buildings placed in this entire calculation. How are these going to affect the carbon emissions from each of these industries, and largely focusing on scope 2 is what we discussed in week 5. Now, in week 6, once we had established that buildings have a role to play when we are talking about carbon emissions of any business for that matter. So, how do we reduce it? How do we reduce the carbon footprint? So, what are these strategies? Before we moved on to these strategies, we looked at some basic terminologies, understood the thermal comfort in building, because most of the energy is actually consumed in buildings for creating thermal comfort. And then we looked at some of the passive design measures, advanced passive design measures, the ventilation, natural ventilation and mechanical ventilation techniques, daylighting, all of which together, all of these strategies together would give us savings in terms of the energy consumption in buildings. In week 7, we looked at, so this was only design. In week 7, we looked at construction part of buildings, where we talked about different materials, how different materials are associated with different carbon emissions, different carbon footprint. So, how can we select the material on the basis of its thermal performance and also on the basis of its own life cycle carbon emissions that are going to be associated, and that is our choice. So, when we select a material, we are influencing all this. Along with that, towards the end of week 7, we started looking at different strategies for renovation and retrofitting. So, not just talking about new buildings and new construction, we were looking at strategies for renovation and retrofitting of emissions, and then we also looked at some of the case studies of various energy efficient building design and construction to give us an idea that how energy efficiency has been achieved in different buildings and how it would impact the scope 2 emissions. And in the last week, we tried to present some of the examples, very brief examples of how we can calculate the reduction in emissions through the strategy that we have selected for HVAC, for fenestration, building envelope and the source of energy. This is the overall course that you have gone through in the last 8 weeks. I hope you were able to gain some knowledge and it was meaningful to you. Kindly send back feedback how we can improve upon this course and make it better in the coming years. Thank you very much for joining me in this course. I hope you had a great time and this duration of 8 weeks was fruitful. Thank you. Bye-bye.